Been a thrill of mine to be here, and I'm just going to be dovetailing, I guess, what Brother Crisp and Brother Gary has already said. And I want to tell you how proud I am of you that are men, that you've come and taken a Friday night and a Saturday to think about the things of God. Our world desperately needs more men like you. It just desperately needs more men like you. And how many of you are members of this church here at Lusby Road, Lusby, Maryland? Where am I today? I was in Texas 2 weeks ago, in South Carolina. I don't even know where I am. But I want to tell you something about your pastor. He is one of the greatest men of God I've ever known. And I've preached in churches all the way from the First Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas, to the Gum Springs Baptist Church in White County, Tennessee. And you've got a rare man of God here, and I love him. And privately, he's a man of God, just like he is behind this pulpit. And I know you're just thankful for that. You know, I have two goals in my life. If I die before Jesus comes, and my body is lying in a casket, I want my children and my wife to come by and say, he was real. And if I'm able to be here when Jesus comes again, I want to be able to look up at him as he's coming in the clouds, look at his nail-scarred hands and his feet, and say, Jesus, I love you. And hear him say, Harold, I know you do. Those are my two goals in life. And Satan is going to do everything he can to destroy that happening in my life. I want you to turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 11. And we're going to see a very interesting story here. And it's involved with the children of Israel as they are leaving Egypt and going to the promised land. Now remember, we're told by the writer of the New Testament, one of the writers, that these things that were written in the Old Testament were not just simply narratives, but they were written to be spiritual examples to us. These stories are. Now let's get the picture, and I already know that you know the picture. The children of Israel are leaving Egypt. Egypt represents where you were when you were lost. Pharaoh represents the devil. The Red Sea represents salvation because it was a miracle crossing. The wandering in the wilderness is where most church members are today. They're busy, but they're not claiming any of the promises of God. And then they get to the Jordan River. And the Jordan River was a miracle crossing just like the Red Sea. But the Jordan River represents that time in your life when, as Brother Gary said the other night, you have a breakthrough and you're tired of just being a nominal, ordinary, go to church on Sunday kind of Christian, and you want the power that I talked about last night. Now, the promised land does not represent heaven because there was war in the promised land, and there won't be any war in heaven. The promised land represents the power-packed, wonderful, authoritative life that's available to every Christian man and woman. But the problem is, out of 2.5 million people that left Egypt, only 2 men made it into the promised land, Caleb and Joshua. The others didn't make it. Now, there were many enemies that tried to stop them from getting into the promised land. And I want to tell every man here, just as Brother Gary pointed out, Brother Chris, you've got an enemy, and that enemy is the devil, and he's going to do everything that he can to keep you from having the kind of life that really is your heritage because you're a child of God. And he's going to do everything that he can to keep you from getting into the promised land. So I want you to look at 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. Then Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said unto Nahash, make a covenant with us and we will serve thee. And Nahash the Ammonite answered them, on this condition will I make a covenant with you, that I may thrust out all your right eyes and lay it for a reproach upon all Israel. And you say, Harold Hunter, I don't see that that has any relevancy at all with me living here in Maryland in 2021. I don't get it. Well, here is the story. The children of Israel are headed toward the promised land, and their enemy is Nahash. Now, I want you to take your ink pen and circle the name Nahash and write this in the margin of your Bible. Put it in the margin of your Bible. Bright, shining serpent. Nahash represents bright, shining serpent. That bright, shining serpent obviously is the devil. So Nahash represents the devil. And he meets the people of God, which represents the church, and the church in actuality is made up of individuals, so it represents you. So here is Nahash, and he meets the people of God. Now I want you to notice where he met them. He met them at Jabesh Gilead. So circle that word, Jabesh Gilead. You see, in our modern days, we name a baby Bill, Bob, Mary, or whatever. But names had a special significance in the Hebrew. Jabesh Gilead, listen, Jabesh Gilead means literally the place of witness. And he said to them, I'm going to destroy you unless you make a deal with me. And the deal is I pluck out your right eye. You say, well, what in the world could that mean? In those ancient days, the ultimate weapon was a bow and arrow in the hands of a skilled archer. And what Nahash knew was this. If I pluck out their right eye, because you see, you are right-eyed just as most people are, as you are right-handed. You get your distance, you get your aim, you get your perception with the right eye. And what Nahash knew was this. If I pluck out that right eye, they no longer will be able to pull the arrow along the bowstring and be able to aim. They will have to aim with their left eye. Listen. And when they shoot by getting their aim with the left eye, they will always miss the mark. Do you know what the Greek word for sin is? Miss the mark. Did you know that this church right here, did you know that Southern Calvary Baptist Church has an enemy? And it's not some obstreperous deacon or some obnoxious woman. Your enemy is the devil. And I got news for you. He's not interested in closing this church up. That may come as a shock to you. He's not interested in closing this church up. He doesn't want it to go out of business. Let me tell you why. Some poor lost man out here, say on Solomon's Island, decides he wants to get saved. He would be better off, Brother Steve, if he came to this church and this church was locked and sold and was a warehouse. He would be better off coming here and the church locked up than to come in here and sit here if this church has made a deal with the devil and has lost its right eye of perception and doesn't see things any right anymore, and then he'll walk out here in worse shape than if he had never come at all. And all over America, churches are making deals with the devil and losing their right eye of perception. And it's happening to individuals. Well, how can I know that it's happening to an individual? Well, you let a man get saved. He'll sit over here on the front row. And the pastor gets up and says, you ought not be drinking any kind of booze, no kind of alcohol. Don't have anything to do with the wine, the beer, the liquor. And this old boy that's just gotten saved, he'll say, you know what? I believe that. I see it exactly like the boy, our preacher's right. Amen. Aren't you glad we got a preacher like that? Thank God. And then you let a few months go by. And that old boy makes a deal with the devil. And he loses his right eye of perception. And he comes back, sits on the same pew. Brother Steve gets up and says, you ought not drink an ounce. You ought not drink any wine. You ought not drink a cold Budweiser after more than lunch. You ought not do any of that. And that old boy sitting there that had agreed with a preacher 6 months earlier, now that he's made a deal with the devil, now that he's lost his right eye perception, he says, you know, I like Brother Steve, but I don't see it that way anymore. And guess what? He's telling the truth. He doesn't see it that way anymore because he's made a deal with the devil. His right eye of perception is gone, and he doesn't see it that way anymore. And your church books are loaded right here at this church with people that made a deal with the devil. How do I know that? How many members you got in this church here on the books? 500. 500. How many are going to be here in the morning? Where's the other 200? If you had 500 here in the morning, people would swear Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump in here singing a duet. Where are they, folks? Come on. Where are all these people on the church books? They made a deal with the devil. They don't see it's necessary to come to the house of God anymore. And what's really tragic, there are people that are coming that are in the pews and some in the pulpits that have made a deal with the devil and don't see things right anymore. And I'm going to tell you this. When you make a deal with the devil and you don't see things right anymore, you're going to hurt your family. You're going to hurt your family. Now, you don't believe you're going to hurt your family. Let me tell you something. Look at me. Reputation is what everybody here at this church thinks about you. When you walk in here with your Sunday school book and your offering envelope and your King James in one hand, NIV in the other hand, and you come in here and there you just got a smile on your face and everybody thinks, isn't he a great, wonderful Christian? That's your reputation. Can I tell you something? Character is what your family knows you are back at the house. Daddy gets in the car on Sunday morning, gets in his Volkswagen and revs that thing up, yells out the window, if you don't get yourself out of here, I'm just going to drive off. They're already going to be talking about politics and ball games and everything out there in the parking lot. You're going to make us late. And here she comes with one baby on this hip, dragging the other by the foot, and opens the side door and flips the seat forward and throws one in the back seat and the other and slams, looks at her husband and said, if you talk to me in that tone of voice one more time, I'll never fix you another bite to eat. Well, if you don't start being on time, I'm just going to start leaving you. That's all right. You make us late. Everywhere we go, we're late. And he pulls into the parking lot here at Southern Calvary Baptist Church and sees the pastor, gets out of the car and says, Pastor, come here a minute. I want you to meet the most wonderful family God ever gave me. And the kids in the back seat are saying, who is this guy? Reputation is what everybody thinks about. And if you don't believe that, folks, if you don't mean it, it already means you made a deal with the devil. You're not seeing things right. You're going to lose your kids. And I wonder how many times there'll be something going on at church on a Sunday night, and your kids start saying, well, you know, I don't think I ought to go. You know, I got a history test in the morning. My mean old history teacher's just looking for a reason to fail me. And I'm going to tell you, if you let your kids stay home from church in order to watch something in a book or a video to get ready for school the next day, I'll tell you what you've done. You've made a deal with the devil because you're saying to that kid, what you learn in a school book is more important than what you learn in God's book. Well, I don't want to turn them against going to church. You won't. Yeah, but if I make them go, I'm going to turn them against it. You made a deal with the devil. When I was growing up, we were poor. I mean, dirt poor. Every night we had pinto beans and cornbread and stewed potatoes. I mean, that is every night, every night. And I said, if I ever live to make a living wage, I'll never eat another pinto bean as long as I live. Guess what I'd rather eat today than anything? Pinto beans. You're not going to turn your kids against it. You're going to make them love it by making them go. Well, I just don't believe that. Really? Then you explain the antique business to me. They sell you junk you tried to give away when you were younger, and now you pay an exorbitantly high price for it because you love what you once hated. You're not only going to hurt your family. I'm going to tell you something else. And by the way, let me just tell you about our kids. You want to hear about Southern Baptist kids? Y'all really want to hear about how many Southern Baptists we got here? Raise your hands. You want to hear about our Southern Baptist kids? Now, I'm into kids. I love this Brother Chris talking about the school system. They say I've spoken face to face to more teenagers in public schools than anybody in America. I have spoken to 1.2 million teenagers in gymnasiums and auditoriums on teen suicide all across America. And I'm going to tell you, we ought to pray for our school teachers. They're the last line of defense we've got. And if we ever paid anybody a higher salary, it ought to be our school teachers for all they have to deal with our kids. But let me just tell you something. There was a survey done about 3-4 years ago. Are you listening to me, Southern Baptist? 92% of the best kids we've got at the age of 18. I'm talking about the ones that go to all the lock-ins and the ones that are there going to Disney World trips and the ones that are there for Bible studies. 92% of the best. I'm not talking about the ones that don't hardly ever come. 92% of the very best teenagers that we've got at the age of 18, by the time they are 25, they will never go to church again except for a wedding or a funeral. You tell me, are we doing much of a job with them? Well, we want to get them to come. So we're trying to buy them off, and he knows that as a teacher. These kids are smarter than that. They know when you're trying to buy them off. They know that you made a deal with the devil. They don't know how to verbalize it, but you made a deal with the devil somehow to placate them and give them fun and somehow just get them into the building, but regardless of the condition of the heart. But you're going to hurt your church too. You make a deal with the devil, you're going to hurt your church. Now, you can talk about homosexuals and drug addicts and all that. That's not what splits churches. You know what splits churches? People that are there for every service but don't have the heart right with God. They're the ones that split the church. And you're going to hurt your church when you make a deal with the devil and you lose your right eye perception. How do you know you've lost your right eye perception? Because you don't see the things the way God sees them anymore. You see them the way the world sees them. You don't see them the way God sees them anymore. How many of you remember the Blackwood brothers and the Statesmen and Spear family and all of them? Raise your hand, raise your hand. All the old people. Young people don't have any idea, Brother Gary, who I'm talking about.
They're missing out.
The Snaps Quartet with J.D. Sumner as bass backed up Elvis the last 7 years of his life in Las Vegas. J.D. had the lowest bass voice in the world. He had a double low C. Now that's low. How many of you have ever heard of the Snaps Quartet and J.D. Sumner? Raise your hand. All right, let's get real. How many have heard of Elvis? Put your hand up. Go ahead. So everybody can raise their hand. I led J.D. Sumner to the Lord. Lowest bass voice in the world. Famous Snaps Quartet at that time. And I led him to the Lord. I'd try to lead him to the Lord and I couldn't get anywhere with him. I just couldn't get anywhere with him. You know why I couldn't get anywhere with him? He actually was more generous than just about any Christian I'd ever met in trying to help people. But finally one night I was preaching at Radnor Baptist Church in Nashville, Tennessee, and J.D. and the Stamps were based there, being a Southern Quartet. So he and his wife came to hear me. And after the service, I was standing outside by one of the pastors, and J.D. came up, and I looked at him, and I said, J.D., did you ever get saved? My brother's a Church of God preacher. I said, I don't care if your brother's the Pope. A man that can drink 2/5 of early times liquor every day and tell the kind of stories you do is not a man that's saved. And I'm just going to tell you something, J.D. If you don't get saved right here, when you die, I'm going to fly to your service, laugh all the way through it, spit on your grave, and say they buried a fool. I ain't never had anybody talk to me like that. Well, I am. About 3 weeks later, I got a call from him from Paducah, Kentucky. They were singing in Paducah. And he was crying. He said, Brother Harold, I said, what? He said, I've just gotten off my knees here at this hotel. I've repented of my sins. I've asked Jesus to save me. I've poured all my liquor down the commode. They're not going to have to use Drano around here for 6 months. And I've just called my wife and told her I've gotten saved and I'm coming home. And I said, what'd Mary say? Oh, you just drunk again. And he went to Hilton Head, South Carolina with her and spent 2 weeks with her. His second honeymoon. And he said, about 3 or 4 weeks later, he called me and he said, I've got a problem. I said, JD, if you started drinking again, I'm going to hunt you down and kill you. He said, no, listen. Are you listening? Listen. Are you listening? Say, we're listening. He said this. He said, for 35 years, when we'd go in with a bus to do a concert, either at an arena, a gymnasium, a civic center, or a church, I would look for the closest package store so that I could send somebody with $10 after the concert to get me a fifth of liquor. Now, he said, I'm not drinking anymore, but it bothers me that I keep wanting to look for these places. But he said, 2 weeks ago, I got to praying about it, and God told me that the next time I'm tempted to look for a place to buy liquor, send somebody $10, to send you the $10 because you led me to the Lord. I said, JD, you need to listen to God. He said, I owe you $180 right now. Sometime after that, I was preaching in a crusade, and he walked into the big box under his arm, walked right up on the platform, said, get over there and pull your boots off and run to this big crowd. I said, why? I got your liquor boots. And he pulled out some of the most beautiful burgundy patent leather Western boots made by Elvis's bootmaker that I've ever seen in my life. And I put them on. He said, these are bought with the money that I've saved that I no longer am drinking liquor. Amen. Now, I want you to listen to me. How many preachers we've got here? Raise your hand if you're a preacher. All right. How many of you really love God and you consider yourself to be a leader in your church somewhere? Raise your, some kind of a leader. Raise your hand up, good. All right, I want everybody to listen. Are you listening? You know what he told me, Brother Steve? He said, Brother Harold, for 35 years I've been singing Southern gospel music. The entire 35 years, I would go to the platform of churches having consumed 2/5 of early times liquor that day. Listen to what he said. For 35 years, I've been going to churches. 250 times a year, they were singing in churches. 250 times a year. For 35 years, they were singing in church. Are you listening? Say, we're listening. Not one time did a preacher or a deacon say before the singing, you're not going to sing on my stage because you've got liquor on your breath. Not one time. He said if they ever had, I'd have gotten saved that very night. I just know I would have. He said, you're the first man to ever look at me and tell me what you did when you said, I'm going to fly to your funeral, spit on your grave, and say they buried a fool. Not one. Come on, folks. You know why no preacher or deacon did it? Would you like to know why? Say, tell us why. I'm going to tell you why. Because the building had the biggest crowd that ever had in it to come to hear that gospel singing. Had chairs in the aisles. Now, how's that going to look, brother, if we don't have a singing? Because when the crowd got there, we had to ask the quartet, you can't sing because the bass singer has liquor on his breath. Why, we can't disappoint this crowd. We can't disappoint this crowd. And you know what J.D. Sumner said to me? I was a bass singer on my way to hell. And those preachers were more concerned about satisfying a godless crowd. He said, you know what the difference is between a gospel singing crowd and a pro wrestling crowd? The night they have it. That's what he said. And he said that bunch at that church for 35 years, 250 times a year, they were selling out their holiness before mighty God in order to have a little bit of religious fun. Come on, folks, is that the truth or not? What had they done? They'd made a deal with the devil. They had made a deal with the devil. They weren't seeing things the way God sees them. I got news for you, folks. I love to preach to a big crowd. I do. I'll be honest, I'll tell you that. But I'm going to tell you something. I'm not interested in preaching one where God's not out there somewhere. I want him there. Now I want to talk about you a minute. We've talked about your family. We've talked about you hurt your church when you make a deal with the devil. Let's talk about you a minute. I believe that every godly man, in fact every woman, but especially every man, ought to have 4 priorities. Are you listening to me? Why don't you write these down, because you won't remember them. You get out here to eating this Chick-fil-A, you ain't going to remember nothing. How many of you brought a pencil? Raise your hand if you brought a pencil. Listen, don't come to hear me preach without an ink pen. That's like a deacon coming without his cigarettes. You got to have your ink pen. All right. I'm going to tell you something. Are you listening to me? In the time that I have left, I've only got about an hour and a half left. I'm going to tell you the things that keeps Harold Hunter straight every day of my life so that I don't make a deal with the devil. I'm going to tell you, you need to know this, and it's kept me straight for over 40 years now. Every day I think of these. Number 1, your first priority ought to be God. Every day that you get up, that ought to be your first priority. Now, I'm going to sound really, really fanatical. What you wear, where you go, you ought to get God's okay before you do it. You know what? We've got a restaurant menu mentality. You know what it is? You go to a restaurant, maybe you got diabetes, but you want to eat that food. So you eat the wrong kind of food and then bow your head and have the audacity to ask God to bless it. Why don't you ask him when you're looking at the menu to tell you what he thinks you ought to eat first? Your first priority ought to be God. You know what your second priority is? Your family. Look at me, man. I could stand up here. I know Brother Gary could. I bet you Brother Steve could. And could name stories of men that have sacrificed their families on the altar of what they do for a living. Come on. Let me tell you mine. God got a hold of my heart one time. By the way, let me tell you something. I don't recommend books, but if I could have every Christian man read one book, it would be Hearing God by Peter Lord. And you can get it on the internet for about $8 or $9. Hearing God by Peter Lord. It changed my life. It changed my life. But after reading that book, I decided, we had a son at that time, 3 or 4 years old, and Star Wars came out. Y'all remember Star Wars? We had taken my son, and he got hooked on it. And I'd made this commitment before God that I was going to be a real godly man. Put my family, number 2, after God. So one day as I was going to get in my car to drive to my church, because I was pastoring at that time, my little boy was standing there in the driveway with a new toy somebody had bought him. It was a replica of the Star Wars spaceship. Y'all know what the name of that was? No, that's Star Trek. Who said that? Who said that? Millennium Falcon. You're young enough. It looks like an air filter off of 53 Dodge, but Somebody had paid good money for it. And my little boy looked at me and he said, Daddy, I got a new toy. Can you come and play with me today out here in the driveway? And I looked at my daily planner and I said, yeah, I can do it. What time? I can come at 3 o'clock. Promise? Yeah. Daddy, sometimes you make promises and you don't do it. Will you come? Yeah. I got to work, Brother Steve, and about 10 o'clock that morning, my secretary came in and said, oh, I'm so excited. I said, why? Mrs. Stewart called. Now, every church has a Mrs. Stewart. I mean, she'll clean the commode or sing in the choir, just do anything you want her to do. I mean, just a priceless person. Miss Stewart called. You know how you've been trying to get her husband saved because he wouldn't even come to church? Yeah, I said, boy, I'm excited. Well, he wants to talk to you. I said, boy, that's fine. I'm going right now. No, he can only see you at 3 o'clock. And I thought there a minute. Now, gentlemen, this is not preacher talk. I'd rather talk to a lost man as eat when I'm hungry. Well, she's on the line. And I picked it up. She went through it all and said, yeah, my husband. I said, I'm sorry, Miss Stewart, I can't do it. Somebody sick? No. You sick? No. Why can't you do it? I said, you're not going to understand this. My little boy has a new toy. And I promised him I'd come at 3 o'clock to play with him. She just hung up. I'm talking about the finest woman in our church. And I want to tell you, there were no angels that patted me on the back and said, aren't you a wonderful man? There was no organ playing the hallelujah chorus. I felt like I had failed her and I had failed God. And if that man dies and goes to hell, it'll be my fault. And I went and played with my little boy. And I had absolutely no joy playing in the driveway when I felt like I ought to be somewhere else. But that night as I put him to bed, he gave me one of them little sloppy kisses kids can do. You ever had one of them just goes all over your face? And he said, Daddy, I love you. But you know what, Daddy? This is the funnest day I ever had. But I really didn't think you'd come home. Because there's always somebody more important than me. Next day, I went to my office. Secretary said, Ms. Stewart's on the line. I said, I'll bet she is. She said, Brother Hunter, I've told everybody why I'm leaving the church. But when I told my husband this morning at breakfast for the first time in our married life, he started crying and said, if that man did that for his son, that's the man I want to tell me about Jesus. Can you come over and have lunch with us? I said, yes, ma'am. Nobody's bought your boy a new toy? I said, no, ma'am. And I had no sooner than got done with my salad than that man pushed from the table and said, Preacher, I didn't invite you over here to eat. I need to hear about Jesus. I need to get saved. You want to hear the rest of the story? That son of mine is going to turn 50 this year. And he thinks anybody is like Jesse James and some outlaw compared to his daddy. He thinks his daddy can walk on water. And I'm going to tell you something, folks. Look at me. Satan almost blinded me in the right eye on a good thing. There's nothing better than leading somebody to the Lord, is there? But I'm convinced, Brother Steve, if I'd have gone that day, I would have lost my son. There's some of you daddies here that need to go home. How many of y'all got little children at home? Are you listening to what I'm saying? What you do out here, that don't impress them at all. It don't impress them a lick. It's whether you keep your promises, and they're number one. Stephen Overton, a good friend of mine, you ought to read everything he says. said that every preacher ought to have a Queen's Day, and everybody else, by all you men too, ought to have a Queen's Day and a Prince's Day. His sons were David and Jonathan. And when you got a Queen's Day, all that day, all you do is whatever your wife wants to do. And on Prince's Day, you do, not just sit in the same room with them, but you do whatever your kids want to do. And you know what? If you'll give 2 days a week to your wife and your kids, they'll let you kill your fool self doing whatever you want to for the other 5. I'm going to hurry. I speak to a lot of service clubs like Rotary and Civitan, and generally they want me to talk about teen suicide and what I'm telling teenagers in rooms. And we were having a crusade at the fairgrounds in Cookeville, Tennessee, and I was speaking at the Rotary Club. And I said, can I tell you something? A lot of kids that kill themselves, not every time, but most of the time, every time a kid kills himself, it's because daddy and mama don't have time for him. There was a young lawyer there, got up and left before I finished. I didn't know why. I thought he had to go back to work. That night at the crusade, as I walked in, I saw him sitting there with a boy that looked about 14 to 15, 16 years old. He said, come here, I want to introduce you to my son. I said, all right. He got off to the side away from his son a little bit. He said, my son been wanting to talk to me for 3 months. I never had time. When you were talking today, I decided I'm going to go home and talk to my son. I knew he was at school, but I wanted to go home. And I said, why'd you want to go home? Well, my son's been wanting to do some things, and I decided I'm going to do them with my son. So I went home, and then I was going to go to school and pick him up. When I went into his room, there was a note, corner of it sticking out on the floor from under the bed. Basically, it said, dear Mom and Dad, nobody loves me. Don't look for me to come home from school. I'm going to take care of it. You will call it suicide. I call it freedom. His son was planning to commit suicide that day. He went to the school, said, I want my boy. Principal said, you can't have it. He says, my boy. Well, you can't have it. We got things we got to do here. He said, I've got some things I got to do here. Well, what, is it somebody sick? What's going on? My son loves the Yankees baseball team. I've already bought some airline tickets. We're going to get on that airplane, and father and son are going to see the Yankees play in New York City, and we're going to eat hot dogs and cotton candy, and we're just going to have the time of our life. And that little boy, I can't hardly talk about without crying, was hearing all that at the fairgrounds. And he had a smile on like his face, like his daddy was the greatest thing that ever lived. His daddy went from having a lifetime of remorse because he had let his son down to becoming his son's hero. Now, ain't that something? God first, family second. Now, here's real quick. What do you think's third priority in your life? Church? It's whatever you do for a living. Then church. Well, why ain't church number 3? I'll tell you why. You spend more time with the people you work with than anybody else. And if you act like a heathen around them, how are you going to have any kind of worship on Sunday? What a lot of people try to do is act like a heathen at work and somehow or another go to Pentecost on Sunday. It won't work that way. Sunday is a celebration of how God has just blessed you unbelievably. I want every daddy to look at me and every man. I got a new favorite verse. And I'm not a King James only, I use them all, but this verse is only good in the King James. I'll just tell you that right now. And it's Psalm 68, verse 19. You know what it says? Bless the Lord, who loads us with benefits every day. He doesn't just give us a few here and there. Bless the Lord. Isn't that a great verse? Well, you could at least nod your head. Isn't that a great verse? Bless the Lord who loads us with benefits. He gives us benefits we don't even know. You know, just like a woman washing the dirty dishes. She wouldn't think that's a benefit, but there are millions of women who'd give anything if they could wash a dirty dish because somebody's had a good meal. It may have been God spared you from having a car wreck or whatever. Bless the Lord who gives us benefits every day. Now, I'm going to close this the way I started. I'm not going to make a deal with the devil. I'm not going to let him take out my right eye of perception and start seeing things the way the world is. I've made up my mind about that. I'm not going to do it. And here's the reason. I truly want my family, or Brother Steve, or Brother Gary, or you. If you happen to be in a town passing through, you hear that my body is over there at a funeral home somewhere, and you think, I'll go by and pay him respects. He preached at a men's conference. I was there. I'm going to go by and pay respects. I want it to be said to the people at that funeral, he was real. But he was in the pulpit. He was real. And oh, if Jesus comes, and I just want to say, Jesus, I love you. And hear him say, Harold, I know you do. God bless you.